Yesterday I happened to be looking at a YouTube clip. I like following technology on YouTube, and it was a 15-minute little YouTube clip on the fall or the demise of the Microsoft smartphone, which may not interest you, but interests me. So apart from Android and iPhones, there used to be Microsoft phones. And in 2006, they were world leaders. They had 34% of the market, and they were ahead of everyone else in 2006. 34%. By 2016, they were 0.4%. Over 10 years, there had been the invention of iPhones and Android phones. And the article, the video ended with, and Microsoft could see the writing on the wall, and they stopped making smartphones. 34% to practically 0%. They saw the writing on the wall. It's amazing how often that phrase comes into the conversation, doesn't it? And the origin, which most people don't know, the origin is from this story here. So let's set the scene. In the past 4 chapters, apart from Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar has been a leading figure. However, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, bows out of the biblical story at the end of chapter 4, and he declares his final words almost are this: "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorifying the King of heaven." And as he fades from the biblical story, chapter 5 now picks up 20 plus years after Nebuchadnezzar has died. And it's been about 70 years since the exile. If we remember, that's when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah and Jerusalem and took a good number of Jewish folk as captives, including Daniel, back to Babylon. So Daniel's now in his mid-80s. So who's ruling Babylon now that Nebuchadnezzar is dead? Well, the city of Babylon is being ruled by Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. History tells us that Belshazzar's father, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was called Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was still alive at this time, but he preferred to rule the empire from one of the northern cities. And so he set his son, Belshazzar, as a regent, as second in command of the kingdom in Babylon. As we pick up the story, we can see things are not going well for the Babylonian Empire. Just a few weeks before the events of chapter 5, a coalition of Medes and Persians had beaten the Babylonian army in the battlefield, and not only had they decisively won a victory, but the army, the Medo-Persian army, had surrounded the city of Babylon. The city of Babylon is under siege. Nobody can go in and nobody can go out. And this is the background of the story that we pick up in chapter 5. And just to refresh our memory of what happens, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, it does say father, but that's often how they referred to each other. Historians will tell us it's actually his grandfather, but that's just how they referred to each other. So here, where are we? So they brought the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wife and his concubines drank for them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold, silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. There's a lot to unpack here. What's happened is 1,000 of the most important people in the city are invited to a party. It's a rage. It's a party that's probably beyond our imagination when it comes to the scale of food and wine that flowed. And not only did they have food and wine, but Nebuchadnezzar got out of the storage the gold and silver goblets that his grandfather, that Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and used those so that they might drink and toast the gods of Babylon. And you say to yourself, well, what could motivate the king? Now, he's besieged by an army. He's been defeated mightily just a few weeks before. Why do you think that he would throw a party like that? Well, First of all, the king felt safe from external threats. The walls of Babylon were legendary, both in their thickness and their height. The river Euphrates ran through the middle of the city, so there was never going to be a problem of the water supply. They were always going to have water. They'd never die of thirst while they were besieged. And not only that, Babylon was a green city. The hanging gardens of Babylon, plenty of water. They could grow a lot of their food. They were surely had a lot of food in storage. And so he wasn't particularly worried about the city from external threats. But internal threats were a different matter. For instance, the leading man of the city, those 1,000 people he invited, they might decide that it's better off that they forcibly take the king and hand him over to the Medes and the Persians and say, we will be your servants, don't destroy the city. And so it's the internal threats that are bothering the king more than external threats. And so what better way to show that he is still king and that he is still in control than to invite these 1,000 people and show them, demonstrate how powerful he was. You may know the expression, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That's what the king is doing here. So, by the extravagance of his party, by taking the goblets from a major victory in the past, just to remind the 1,000 about the military victories in the past, and by toasting the gods of Babylon and winning their favour, the king has demonstrated to the 1,000 most powerful people in the city that he's in control, he's victorious in battle, and that he has the favour of the Babylonian gods. However, by toasting the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone in gold and silver goblets from the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, then he has overstepped the mark. It's hard to think of what the king could do better to publicly embarrass and disgrace the living God. And this is why things don't turn out well for the king. Verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Here we can imagine the blood draining from the king's face and his knees collapsing and him falling on the ground as this miraculous hand, wrote on the plaster in the wall. And even when the hand disappeared, there was no relief, because there was some writing there, but nobody could discern what the writing was. So for the third time in the book of Daniel, we see a king calling for the interpreters, the magicians, the wise men, and the astrologers to come and interpret the message. And for the third time, we see that they are hopeless. They have no idea what the writing means. Until finally, as an afterthought, Daniel is called in to interpret the writing on the wall. Now the king gives a lot of flattering words to Daniel and promises him great riches. Daniel, however, turns down the offer of riches, but still agrees to interpret the writing on the wall. And we see this in verse 18. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty, greatness, and glory and splendour. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and the nations and the men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God was sovereign over all kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. So before Daniel starts to interpret the writing on the wall, he gives the king a lesson in his own family history. Now here's the thing. Belshazzar was probably alive as a young lad when his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by God and went out and lived among the cattle as a wild animal. Because of King Nebuchadnezzar's pride, he became less than human. And Belshazzar probably was alive, and he knew that story. And yet, while his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, chose to look up and humble himself and have the words of God's praises on his lips, this king, his grandson, Belshazzar, has chosen not to look to God, but to boast. So where his grandfather boasted that the living God was Lord over all men, his grandson Belshazzar is boasting that the Babylonian gods are Lord over all men. His grandfather honoured the living God, the grandson dishonoured the living God. And so there will be consequences. And so we read this, and Daniel goes on to explain what the writing on the wall means. Therefore, the inscription that is written, many, many tekel parsons. This is what the words mean. And he's just about to give an interpretation. See, the other people couldn't even pronounce the letters or the words, yet Daniel here can pronounce those 4 words. And then in verse 26, he gives the meaning. This is what these words mean. Many. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, which is the singular of passion. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So there's a threefold judgment announced on the proud king. His days are numbered and are coming to an end. He has been weighed and compared to a standard and found sadly lacking. Now, it's interesting to know what standard he's been weighed against. I would speculate to say that he's been compared to his grandfather, and that compared to his grandfather, he is sadly lacking. I mean, there's probably a higher standard than that, but at least God has compared him to his grandfather and found him wanting. And the third judgment is your kingdom will be taken from you. And here's the crucial thing. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, whose kingdom was restored, his grandson Belshazzar will not have his kingdom restored. This then is the judgment that God has announced on this proud and unrepentant king. Many, many tekel parson. Now things quickly come to a head as the chapter ends. First of all, the king fulfills his promise to Daniel. Then at Belshazzar's command, this is verse 29, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And just as an aside, why do you think he was the third highest ruler? Well, there was Belshazzar's father was number 1, Belshazzar was number 2, and so the highest that Belshazzar could promote anybody in the kingdom was number 3 in the kingdom. So he was promoted to number 3 in the kingdom. It's a shame, I suppose, for Daniel that it only lasts a few hours, because the chapter finishes with these quite sad words for the king. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. 62 is a very good age, I can say. 62. So what had happened was, while this party was going on, the besieging army had re-diverted the Euphrates River. And so what it meant is that the river that had gone through the city was now a dry riverbed. And so the Medes and the Persians, their army, their soldiers, they just came in through the dry riverbed. And that meant that they circumvented the big walls. And so while they were partying, the enemy, Medes and the Persians, had come into the city, and they'd started to defeat it. And that's why that night Belshazzar was killed, and Darius took over the kingdom. Now Darius, who is a Mede, will feature very highly next week. In fact, is responsible for throwing Daniel into the lion's den. But we'll pick up that story of Daniel and Darius next week. So what about us this week as we think about the story and what it means to us? Well, the first thing, 3 things we're going to learn, 3 implications for us. The first thing is human security doesn't last. Where did Belshazzar put his faith? He put his faith in the walls of his city and the preparation that happened. And this human security never lasts. And it's the same with us. If we try and put our security in human things, it won't last. Okay, the king thought, well, because I've got these walls surround me, I can indulge in wild parties, I can mock the living God, and there will be no consequences for me because I trust in the walls that surround my city. And it's similar with us. We cannot trust our human achievements and then think that we can get away with bad behaviour. No matter the power, position, prestige, no matter the wealth, wisdom, or wonderful potential, no matter the amazing accomplishments or the great esteem that we may have in church, none of this can shield us from an all-powerful, all-knowing God who brings every dark thing to light and judges every sin. Numbers chapter 32:23 makes this clear, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Have you heard that expression before? Your sin will find you out? Well, that comes from Numbers 32:23. And Ecclesiastes 12:14. For God will bring every deed into judgment, include every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And so we can't rely on our past credit for protection when we stray. We can't say, oh, because I believe in God and because I've served Him all these decades, then I can indulge in this bad behaviour and it will be okay. Or we can't say, because I've tithed thousands of dollars over the years and will continue to tithe to God's kingdom, I can indulge in this indiscretion. We cannot trust human security, human achievement. One of the important lessons of Daniel chapter 5 is that we cannot trust human security. It never lasts. Second thing we can learn from this story is that pride has its consequences. There is a very much an example of laying down 2 case studies. One is Nebuchadnezzar and the other is his grandson Belshazzar. Remember how Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride, he boasted, is not this the great Babylon I have built at the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? The height of his pride, God struck him down so that he became less than human and behaved like a wild animal. Yet, he looked up, he looked to God and repented and then praised God. Now we compare this with Belshazzar, who was equally as proud. However, his grandson refused to look up to God and instead of publicly praising God, publicly mocked God. And the consequences for these 2 kings were many, tekel, parsin. The king Belshazzar, his days were numbered, he was weighed and found wanting, and everything was taken from him. And though it's unlikely that the consequences of our indiscretions, our sin will be, or our pride will be so dramatic, we are warned not to let pride take root, for pride is the destroyer of all good things. And the good news about these 2 comparisons is that it gives us a way out. When we recognise that pride has taken root, we can follow the example of Nebuchadnezzar, look to God and ask His forgiveness, and then praise His name. So that's the second thing. Pride has its consequences. And the third thing, which is a bit grim, is that we will be judged. The warning, many tekel, parsin, applies to us. Our days are numbered. We have been weighed and found wanting, and everything will be taken from us. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. But I tell you that men and women will have to give account on the day of judgment for every careless word that they have spoken. It's quite sobering, isn't it? From the Apostle Paul, we had this, 2 Corinthians 5:10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that each one may receive what is due him and her for the things done while on the body, whether good or bad. And Hebrews 9:27, short and sweet and grim. Man is destined to die once, and after that face judgment. See, we all will have to face judgment. However, the good news of the gospel is that the writing on the wall is not our final warning. You see, for King Belshazzar, the writing on the wall was his final warning and he didn't get a second chance. It's different for us because the writing on the wall still applies to us. Our final warning is instead the cross. Yes, we will face judgment, but many tekel parsin has been superseded by the cross. The cross absorbs our judgment. It absorbs this warning. Look at it like this. The cross stands as the ultimate warning of the consequences of sin. If you want to say, well, how bad is sin? Then you have to look at the cross of Calvary. And this is the problem with people who try to minimize sin and say, well, I'm just like everyone else. I'm no better and no worse, and I have my failings. But unlike the writing on the wall, we look to the cross. And the cross tells us how bad sin is, because the only way that God could remove sin from our life was with the death of his only son, his only beloved son. I mean, that's how serious it is. His only son, whom he loved, had to die in our stead. And so like the writing on the wall, the cross points to our sin and our judgment and how bad it is. It's the ultimate warning that God will judge us. However, as it's the ultimate warning of our sin, and even a greater way, it is the ultimate expression of God's love for us. Because on the one hand, it says that we will all be judged, and look how terrible sin is that it cost Jesus' life. But on the other hand, because God set his affection on us before the beginning of time, Jesus took our judgment on himself, that we might be right, that we might be adopted as dearly loved daughters and sons, and that we may escape the judgment of many tekel parsin. I mean, Isaiah 53 puts it like this. But he, this is Jesus, was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, and each one of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. So on the one hand, while the cross reminds us that we face judgment, the cross reminds us we will not face judgment alone. Instead, we are confident and assured that Christ paid for our sin, and he is our advocate at the right hand of the throne of God. So, I mean, the gospel is always good news, bad news. The bad news is how desperate our situation is and how much it cost God, his only son, to fix it. But of course, it's the good news is that God has fixed it, and we can have eternal, abundant life in Christ. Now, this judgment thing is a bit of a heavy thing to get your head wrapped around. I have a little video clip that I want to show now that shows us the role that Jesus plays when it comes to our final judgment. So let's see if that's going to go. There we go.
Next. File, please. Some lying, some stealing, and some acts of kindness here and there.
I tried to live a good life.
Well, let's see how good. This way. Next. File, please.
Okay, I admit it. I did a lot of bad things.
Yes, I see.
But I've done good things too, to offset the bad things. Like one time I cheated on a test, but then I cleaned up trash in the park. That should balance out, right?
Let's find out. This way.
That should have balanced out, right? It should have balanced out.
Next. Bio, please. Impressive.
Oh, yeah. I devoted my entire life to make this world a better place. I dug wells in Africa. I donated blood every month. And I ran an orphanage in India. I mean, I just wish I could have done more.
And is this your subscription?
I only read the articles. I only read the articles. I only read the articles.
Next.
My mom goes to church.
I was baptized as a baby?
Take American Express, right?
Next. File, please. Whoa. Somebody's been busy. Well, let's get this over with. Sorry, I didn't know he was with you. Okay, step on the scale. Not you. Him.
Hey, wait a minute. That is totally not fair.
That's why it's called grace. Next.
What an insightful parable. I've seen that so many times, and each time it just strikes me as summing up what it means to be a Christian. You know, so all those people go up there and they think they can get, they think they've done enough. They're trusting on human achievement, and they think it will get them through. But it won't. And the only thing that will get us through is when we trust Jesus. And that's the whole point of the cross. He took all our sin and our failings and our shortcomings so that when we come to stand before the throne of God, we will be accepted as dearly loved children of God. And that's why it's good news. Wonderful news. So what have we looked at today? Let's sum up. We've seen Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, in his pride, mocked the living God. However, God would not be mocked, so he sent the writing on the wall, that mysterious handwriting that appeared that only Daniel could interpret. And with these words, many, many tekel parsin, the king was judged. And those words still stand for us. Our days are numbered, we've been judged, found wanting, and everything we have will be taken from us when it comes to the final judgment. However, because Christ took that judgment on himself, our final judgment, just like in that video clip, has no fear. For not only is the cross a sign of the depth of our sin and how much we deserve judgment, the cross is a sign of how much God loved us and the price that Jesus paid. This is the good news of the gospel. Let's pray.